Our love was forbidden, but never wrong. Have you ever risked everything for love? Have you ever found that one person who made your heart beat faster, who understood your soul, even though the world told you that loving them was wrong? This is James's story, a tale of courage, heartbreak, and the kind of love that defies all boundaries. Listen to the end to discover if love really can conquer all. And tell me in the comments, if you were in his shoes, what would you have done? The old wooden bench creaked under James Mitchell's weight as he settled into the familiar groove that had formed over years of sitting in the same spot. At 63, his once athletic frame had softened, and the golden brown hair that had been his pride was now mostly silver. But his eyes, those deep blue wells that had once captivated everyone who looked into them, still sparkled with the same intensity, especially when he spoke about her, about Catherine. The small town of Millfield, Connecticut, had barely changed in the 40 years since their story began. The same maple trees lined Main Street, their leaves now turning brilliant shades of orange and red as autumn settled over the New England landscape. The bell of the town church still rang at noon, and old Mrs. Peterson's bakery still filled the air with the scent of fresh bread every morning. It was a picture-perfect American town, the kind you'd see on postcards, charming, traditional, and deeply set in its ways. James took a deep breath, feeling the crisp October air fill his lungs. This town had been both his prison and his sanctuary, the place where he had found the greatest love of his life, and the place where that love had been condemned. I was 23 when I first saw her, James began, his voice steady but soft with the weight of memory. It was 1985, and I had just taken over my father's law practice after he passed. Everyone in town knew the Mitchells. We'd been Millfield's attorneys for 3 generations, and people expected certain things from me. The expectations had been crushing. James was to marry well, preferably someone from one of the other founding families. He was to join the country club, attend church every Sunday, coach Little League when he had sons of his own, and eventually run for town council, just as his father had. His life had been mapped out before he was even born, a path as straight and narrow as Millfield's Main Street. I was engaged to Diane Whittaker, James continued, a small, rueful smile playing on his lips. The perfect match, according to everyone. Her father owned the bank, my father was the town lawyer. We'd known each other since kindergarten, and getting married just seemed like the natural next step. I didn't love her, not the way a man should love the woman he plans to spend his life with, but I liked her well enough. And in Millfield, that was considered more than sufficient. Everything changed on a sweltering July afternoon. The kind of day where the air hangs heavy and still, when even breathing feels like an effort. James had been in his office, the ancient ceiling fan doing little more than pushing the hot air around. His shirt clung to his back, and the words on the legal documents before him swam together in the heat. That's when she walked in, James said, his voice softening with the memory. Catherine Lopez. She wasn't from Millfield. Anyone could see that. She carried herself differently, spoke differently. She'd moved from California to take care of her elderly aunt, old Miss Abernathy, who lived in that blue Victorian on Elm Street. Catherine had been stunning in a way that made you look twice. Not classically beautiful like Diane, with her blonde hair and delicate features, but striking. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her brown eyes held a warmth and intelligence that immediately drew James in. But it wasn't just her appearance that captivated him. It was the confidence with which she carried herself, the subtle defiance in her stance, as if she knew she didn't fit in and didn't particularly care. She needed help with her aunt's will, James explained. Simple enough. Should have been a 1-hour consultation, 2 at most. But we talked for 4 hours that day, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. Not as Martin Mitchell's son, not as Diane Whittaker's fiancé, but as James. Just James. It wasn't love at first sight. James didn't believe in such things. But it was recognition, a sense that he had found someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. They connected over books they'd read, places they wanted to visit, dreams they'd never shared with anyone else. And when she finally left his office as the sun was setting, James knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be the same. "I told myself it was just friendship," James said, shaking his head at his own naivety. Catherine was half Mexican, from a working-class family in Los Angeles. She'd worked her way through college, then through graduate school. She was a professor of literature on sabbatical to care for her aunt. We couldn't have been more different. And in 1985, in a town like Millfield, those differences mattered. They mattered a lot. But despite the differences, or perhaps because of them, James found himself inventing reasons to see Catherine. Her aunt's will suddenly required multiple consultations. He discovered legal issues with her aunt's property that needed immediate attention. And when he ran out of professional excuses, he simply started appearing at places he knew she would be. The local bookstore, the coffee shop where she graded papers, the park where she took her daily walks. "I was transparent," James admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. "Everyone saw it, even if they didn't know exactly what they were seeing." Diane noticed first. She'd always been perceptive. She started showing up at my office unannounced, planning more wedding details, marking her territory. And I let her because I was a coward. The town noticed too. Small towns always do. The whispers started about how much time the Mitchell boy was spending with that Lopez woman, about how inappropriate it was, how disrespectful to Diane. Catherine heard the whispers too, and she tried to distance herself. She understood what was at stake for James, his reputation, his family name, his place in the community. "But I couldn't stay away from her," James said, his voice cracking slightly. "It was like she was gravity, and I was helpless against that pull. We tried to be just friends. God, how we tried. But there was this electricity between us. Every time our hands accidentally touched, every time our eyes met, it was like a current passing between us. I'd never felt anything like it before, and I knew I never would again." 3 months after Catherine walked into his office, James found himself standing on her aunt's porch at midnight, soaked to the skin from the autumn rain, unable to stay away any longer. He hadn't planned to go there. He'd been lying awake next to Diane, listening to her soft breathing, feeling like the worst kind of fraud. And then he was in his car, driving through the rain, with no clear idea of what he would say when he arrived. Catherine opened the door, and I just stood there, water dripping from my hair, unable to speak, James recounted. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She just took my hand and led me inside. And then I was kissing her, and it felt like coming home. Like I'd been wandering lost my whole life, and finally found where I belonged. That night changed everything. They knew there was no going back, no pretending anymore. What they felt for each other was too powerful to deny, too real to ignore. But they also knew what they were up against. Millfield wasn't ready for a relationship like theirs. Not in 1985, not with James Mitchell, from one of the town's oldest families, and Catherine Lopez, an outsider with brown skin and a Spanish surname. "We tried to keep it secret," James said, his eyes distant as he remembered, "for her sake as much as mine. Catherine was already an outsider. The town barely tolerated her presence as it was. If they knew about us, I couldn't bear to think about how they would treat her. For 2 months they lived in a bubble of their own making. Secret meetings at her aunt's house when the old woman was asleep. Long drives to neighboring towns where no one knew them, where they could walk hand in hand without fear of being seen. Hushed phone calls late at night. It was thrilling and terrifying, and more real than anything James had ever experienced. But secrets have a way of coming out, James said, his voice heavy with the inevitability of what happened next. Especially in a town like Millfield. It was Mrs. Peterson who saw them first. The baker had been making an early morning delivery to a neighboring farm and spotted James's car parked outside Catherine's aunt's house at 5 in the morning. By noon, the news had spread through town like wildfire. By evening, Diane was at his door, tears streaming down her face, demanding an explanation. "I couldn't lie to her," James said simply. "Not anymore. She deserved better than that. So I told her the truth, that I had fallen in love with Catherine, that I couldn't marry her, that I was sorry for the pain I was causing, but that I couldn't live a lie anymore." Diane's pain quickly turned to anger, and her anger to vengeance. The daughter of Millfield's most powerful man wasn't going to be humiliated without consequences. By the next day, the entire town knew not just about the affair, but about Catherine's background, embellished to make her sound as foreign and inappropriate as possible. Suddenly, she wasn't just an outsider. She was a temptress, a homewrecker, a woman of questionable morals who had seduced the town's golden boy away from his perfect fiancée. The backlash was immediate and brutal, James said, his voice tight with remembered pain. My clients started cancelling appointments. Old friends crossed the street to avoid talking to me. The pastor gave a sermon about the sanctity of marriage vows that everyone knew was directed at me, even though Diane and I had only been engaged, not married. But Catherine, God, they were cruel to her. Catherine lost her position at the local college where she'd been teaching a few classes. Her aunt's caretaker quit, leaving Catherine to shoulder the burden alone. Women pulled their children away when she walked past, as if what she and James shared was somehow contagious. Men looked at her with open contempt, or worse, with leering interest, as if her relationship with James had marked her as somehow available. The hardest part was that she never complained, James said, his voice breaking. Not once. She would come home from grocery shopping, where the cashier had deliberately overcharged her, or from the pharmacy where they'd made her wait for hours for her aunt's medication. And she would just smile and say it didn't matter. But I saw the toll it was taking on her. How could I not? James fought back as best he could. He confronted former friends, challenged the whispers, even threatened to sue for slander when the rumors became particularly vicious. But he was one man against an entire town's worth of prejudice and small-mindedness. And every day he watched the light in Catherine's eyes dim a little more. I asked her to marry me, James said, a sad smile crossing his face. 6 months after we were found out. I bought a ring I couldn't really afford. My practice was barely surviving by then, and I took her to the waterfall outside of town, the one place we could still go without being harassed. I told her I didn't care what anyone thought, that I wanted to spend my life with her. And do you know what she said? Catherine had looked at him with those deep brown eyes, now shadowed with exhaustion and sadness, and she had said no. Not because she didn't love him. She did desperately, but because she couldn't bear to watch him lose everything for her. His family name, his practice, his home, his community. She loved him too much to let him make that sacrifice. We had our first real fight that night, James recalled. I was furious with her. I told her it was my choice to make, not hers. That none of it meant anything without her. But she was stubborn. God, was she stubborn. She said she wouldn't be the reason I lost everything I'd worked for. And then she told me she was leaving Millfield. Her aunt had died the week before, and there was nothing keeping her in town anymore, except James. And Catherine believed, truly believed, that once she was gone, the town would forgive him. He could rebuild his practice, mend fences with the community, maybe even reconcile with Diane if that's what he wanted. Without the daily reminder of their relationship, the scandal would fade, and James could reclaim his place in Millfield. I begged her not to go, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I pleaded, I raged. I made promises I had no idea if I could keep. But her mind was made up. She had already accepted a teaching position at a university in Oregon, clear across the country. She was leaving in 2 days. Those last 2 days were a blur of desperate love and crushing heartbreak. They spent every moment together, memorizing each other's faces, the sound of each other's laughter, the feel of each other's touch. They made promises they both knew might be impossible to keep, to write, to call, to somehow find their way back to each other when the world was more accepting, when the timing was better. The morning she left, I drove her to the bus station in Hartford, James said. It was raining again, just like the night I'd first shown up at her door. She kissed me one last time, whispered that she would always love me, and then she was gone. I stood there in the rain for hours after her bus had left, unable to move, unable to comprehend a world without her in it. James returned to a Millfield that was ready to forgive him, just as Catherine had predicted. They viewed him as the victim of a seductress, a good man led astray who had come to his senses in the end. Clients started to return to his practice. Invitations to community events began to appear in his mailbox. Even Diane, after some time, was civil when they passed each other on the street. But I couldn't forgive them, James said, a flash of the old anger returning to his eyes. I couldn't forget how they had treated her, the woman I loved, how their small-mindedness and prejudice had driven her away. I went through the motions. I rebuilt my practice. I attended the necessary social functions. I was polite and professional. But a part of me died when Catherine left, and everyone in town knew it. James and Catherine wrote to each other, long letters full of love and longing. They spoke on the phone, when they could afford the long-distance charges. Twice James flew to Oregon to see her, brief visits that left him more heartbroken than before. But as the months turned into years, the letters became less frequent, the phone calls shorter. Catherine was building a new life in Oregon, making friends, advancing in her career. And James was trapped in Millfield, a town he now hated but couldn't seem to leave. I tried to leave, you know, James said, shaking his head at the memory. 3 times I packed up my car and started driving west. And 3 times I turned around before I reached the state line. I told myself it was because of my clients, because of my responsibility to the town that had been my family's home for generations. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid that Catherine had moved on. Afraid that the life she'd built wouldn't have room for me anymore. Afraid that what we'd had was already just a memory for her. 5 years after Catherine left, James received a letter from her with news that shattered what was left of his heart. She had met someone, a fellow professor at her university, a kind man who loved her, who wasn't afraid to love her openly, in the light. They were getting married in the spring. She wrote that she would always love me, that what we had shared had changed her life, James said, his voice hollow with the remembered pain. But she couldn't wait forever for a future that might never come. She deserved happiness, a real life, not just letters and memories and brief visits that left her heartbroken all over again. And I couldn't argue with that. I wanted her to be happy, even if it killed me, that I wouldn't be the one to make her so. James didn't respond to that letter. He couldn't find the words. Instead, he threw himself into his work, taking on more cases than he could handle, working himself to exhaustion so he wouldn't have to think, wouldn't have to feel. He dated occasionally. There were always women interested in the town's eligible bachelor attorney, but nothing ever lasted. No one could compare to Catherine, to what they had shared. Years passed, James continued. I turned 30, then 40. Millfield changed, but not quickly enough. The world changed around us. Interracial relationships became more accepted, at least in bigger cities, in more progressive places. I watched it all from a distance, this evolution I had wanted so desperately to be part of. And I wondered every day if Catherine was happy with the life she had chosen. James had no way of knowing. After her marriage announcement, they stopped corresponding. It was too painful for both of them, this half-life of letters and memories. James had no social media presence. He still barely used email for anything other than work. The only news he had of Catherine came through mutual friends, rare snippets that he both craved and dreaded. I heard she had children, 2 daughters, James said, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. That her husband was kind to her, that she had become a respected professor, published books, made a real difference in her field. I was happy for her, truly. But there was always this hollow place inside me, this sense that my real life had ended the day she got on that bus. 20 years after Catherine left Millfield, James's mother died. The funeral was well attended. The Mitchells were still one of the town's oldest families, even if James had never quite regained his former standing. He stood at the graveside, accepting condolences from people he had known his entire life, but had never felt more distant from. "And then I saw her," James said, his voice filled with wonder even after all these years, standing under a maple tree at the edge of the cemetery. Older, of course. We were both in our 40s by then, but still so beautiful it made my heart ache. Catherine. She'd come back for my mother's funeral. They met at a coffee shop after the service, neutral ground where they could talk without the weight of too many memories. Catherine's husband had died 2 years earlier, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. Her daughters were in college. She had taken a sabbatical to finish her latest book and had seen the obituary for James's mother in an academic newsletter that somehow still listed Millfield as her hometown. "We talked for hours," James recalled, catching up on 20 years of life lived apart, and it was like no time had passed at all. That same connection, that same understanding. But we were different people by then, shaped by the lives we'd lived, the choices we'd made. The James and Catherine who had fallen in love in 1985 didn't exist anymore. Catherine was leaving the next day, returning to the life she had built in Oregon. They exchanged email addresses, promised to stay in touch this time. And they did, sporadically at first, then more regularly. Monthly emails became weekly phone calls. When one of Catherine's daughters got married, she invited James to the wedding. When he won a major case that made regional news, she called to congratulate him. "We built a friendship," James explained. "A real one, based on who we were now, not just on the memory of what we had been." And that was enough for a while. It had to be. 5 more years passed. James turned 50. Catherine retired from teaching and devoted herself to writing full-time. Her youngest daughter moved to New York, leaving Catherine alone in Oregon. James's practice was thriving, but he felt increasingly disconnected from Millfield, from the life he had built there. "I called her on a Tuesday night in April," James said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Just a regular call, nothing special. We were talking about books we'd read recently, movies we'd seen. And suddenly, I heard myself asking her if she ever thought about what might have been. If she ever wondered what our life together would have looked like." There was a long silence on the line. So long that James thought he had made a terrible mistake, had ruined the friendship they had so carefully rebuilt. And then Catherine had answered, her voice soft but certain, "Every day. I think about it every day." It was as if a dam had broken. All the feelings they had carefully contained, all the longing they had denied for 25 years came rushing out. They talked until sunrise, about regrets and second chances, about courage and forgiveness, about the possibility of a love that had never really died, just gone dormant, waiting for the right time to bloom again. "I asked her to marry me," James said, his voice strong and clear, right there over the phone like a lovesick teenager. "Told her I'd fly to Oregon the next day if she said yes, that we'd wasted too many years already, and I wasn't willing to waste a single day more." Catherine didn't say yes right away. She was practical, cautious. Life had taught her to be. She asked for time to think, to consider what it would mean to uproot her life again, to return to a town that had once rejected her so completely. James understood. He had waited 25 years. He could wait a little longer. 3 days later she called me back, James continued. She said she had one condition, that I leave Millfield, that we start fresh somewhere new, somewhere without the weight of history and prejudice, somewhere we could just be James and Catherine, not the town lawyer and the woman who wasn't good enough for him. It should have been a difficult decision. Millfield was the only home James had ever known. His family had been there for generations. His practice was there, his clients, his whole life. But the moment Catherine laid out her condition, James felt nothing but relief. He had been waiting for permission to leave for 25 years. I sold my practice to my junior partner, James said. Put my house on the market. Started packing up 50 years' worth of life in Millfield. And you know what? It was the easiest thing I've ever done. The town was shocked, the last Mitchell, leaving after all these generations. But I didn't care. For the first time since Catherine had left, I felt like I could breathe again. They decided on Santa Fe, New Mexico. Neither of them had ever lived there, but they had both visited and loved its blend of cultures. Its art scene, its open skies and vibrant colors. It was as far from Millfield's rigid traditionalism as they could get. They bought a small adobe house on the outskirts of town, with a view of the mountains and a garden where Catherine could grow the herbs she used in her cooking. We got married in Santa Fe, James said, his face softening at the memory. Nothing fancy, just us, Catherine's daughters, and a few close friends. I was 51, she was 50. Not exactly young newlyweds. But when I saw her walking toward me, wearing a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair, I felt 23 again, like my life was just beginning. The transition wasn't always easy. James had to take the New Mexico bar exam, had to build a new practice from scratch. Catherine had to adjust to sharing her space, her life, after years of independence. They had arguments, misunderstandings, moments of doubt. But underneath it all was the unshakable certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, finally together after all the years apart. We've been married for 12 years now, James said, looking down at the simple gold band on his finger. 12 years that have been fuller and richer than all the years that came before. We've traveled, seen the places we used to only dream about. We've watched Catherine's daughters start families of their own. I have 3 step-grandchildren now, and they call me Grandpa James, like I've always been part of their lives. James returned to Millfield only once, for his father's funeral. Catherine came with him, her hand firmly in his, a silent statement to the town that had once torn them apart. Some things had changed. There were other interracial couples now, other people who didn't fit the town's once rigid mold. Some of the old prejudices had faded, though not all. Some people were welcoming. Others still averted their eyes when they saw James and Catherine together. But it didn't matter anymore, James said with quiet certainty. What they thought, what they said, none of it had any power over us. We had finally learned the lesson that had taken us 25 years to understand. That love, real love, is never wrong, even when the world says it is. That some things are worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth sacrificing everything for. James stood up from the bench, wincing slightly as his knees protested. Age was catching up with him, as it was with Catherine. But they had these years together, 12 years of mornings waking up beside each other, of shared meals and shared dreams, of building a life that was wholly their own. 12 years that had made all the heartbreak worthwhile. I still think about what might have been, James admitted, gazing out at the maple trees with their brilliant autumn colors. If we had been braver back then, if the world had been kinder, the years we lost, the life we might have built together, the children we might have had. But then I look at what we have now, this hard-won happiness, this love that survived 25 years of separation, this life we've created together, and I can't bring myself to regret the path that led us here. The church bell rang in the distance, marking noon just as it had for as long as James could remember. Some things never changed, but James had changed, and so had Catherine, and so, slowly but surely, was the world around them. Their love had once been forbidden, condemned by a town too small-minded to see its beauty and truth. But it had never been wrong. Never. "We're flying back to Santa Fe tomorrow," James said, turning away from the maple trees and the town that had both nurtured and nearly destroyed him. "Catherine is waiting for me at our hotel. Tonight we'll have dinner with some old friends, the few who stood by us back then, who saw our love for what it was rather than what the town said it should be. And tomorrow we'll go home, to the life we've built together, to the love that waited 25 years to be lived in the open, in the light." James walked away from the bench, away from the memories of a younger man who had been too afraid to follow his heart, who had let the woman he loved leave rather than stand against a town's prejudice. That man was gone now, transformed by time and love and second chances into someone braver, someone worthy of the love Catherine had always offered so freely. "Our love was forbidden," James whispered as he reached his car. "But it was never wrong, never. What would you have done if you were in James's shoes? Would you have had the courage to defy an entire town for love? Or would you have let your soulmate go, thinking it was for the best? And if life gave you a second chance at love after 25 years, would you be brave enough to take it?" Comment below with your thoughts. Remember to like and subscribe for more real-life stories that will touch your heart and make you believe in the power of love against all odds.